Sometimes I like how the Message translates the scriptures. It opens up to new ideas and so forth. But this time I think I'd like to go back to the sort of more traditional version of this. This is Matthew 18, 1-5 from the Common English Bible. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And then he called over a little child to sit among the disciples and said, "I assure you that if you don't turn your lives around and become like this little child, you will definitely not enter the kingdom of heaven. Those who humble themselves like this little child will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." So in the series we've been doing this summer, 2 weeks ago, a Canaanite woman refused to be dismissed. And Jesus told her, "Woman, great is your faith." And last week, Jesus called the disciples, "You of little faith." And then Peter correctly answered a question about who Jesus is. "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." But a few verses later, Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So we got great faith and little faith, and we've got the disciple who gets it right and then immediately gets it wrong. And all of this is a little bit more than disorienting. So as they're trying to understand, what does all this mean? This week, the disciples asked Jesus, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now, that's a question we've heard before in other Gospels, in Mark and Luke. But in those Gospels, the question came after the disciples were caught arguing with each other along the way. Who is the greatest? That's not Matthew. No, here is simply a question. And by now, perhaps they knew to expect that Jesus' answer might not be what they expect. Might surprise them. And it did. Because he said, "Those who humble themselves like this little child will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Now, to our ears, that sounds quintessentially Jesus. I mean, of course, that's something Jesus would say. But the disciples are still trying to figure this upside-down nature of what he's talking about. They're trying to figure this out. But I also want to be clear. Let's first talk about kingdom of heaven. So this is not talking about some heavenly afterlife. The kingdom of heaven is about the kind of world we live in now. And I've used this line before to help understand. It's not pie in the sky by and by after we die. Is something sound on the ground while we're still around. So when they ask, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, we're talking now. We're talking not someday. So Jesus calls the little child over and says, "You must turn your lives around and become like this little child." Jesus knows how often we look in the wrong direction. And then he gestures and answers their question. Those who humble themselves like this little child will be the greatest. Now, who are we accustomed to looking at as the greatest? Maybe the ones who win the most trophies or awards or degrees. The ones who are at the tops of their fields of study. We measure by money. The ones whose name everybody knows, they are really somebody. But turn around and look over here, because Jesus may have a surprise. So one of Henry Nouwen's jobs at the monastery was washing raisins. He wasn't a monk. He was a successful author and a professor at Yale University. He's also a psychologist and a Catholic priest. But in 1974, he stepped away from all of that for 7 months to live in a monastery in upstate New York, in Genesee. He wanted to enter the monastic rhythm of work and prayer because he wanted to learn how to simply be with God. But even while washing raisins and kneading dough in the monastery's bakery, he couldn't help wanting the abbot to approve of him. His attention kept being drawn away by his nagging need for the monks to like him. He yearned for his work to be more useful. I mean, he was gifted at teaching and writing and counseling, but manual labor, not so much. And he found that monastic repetitive rhythm of prayer and work more tedious than spiritually profound. Ultimately, he discovered how badly he needed to know that people liked him and valued what he had to offer and needed what he could give to be recognized as somebody. And he realized that silence doesn't take that insecurity away. In fact, silence makes it worse, harder to avoid. And so he often found himself lonely and disappointed and frustrated. And yet he also spoke of these months as truly transformative. There were deep friendships and moments of grace and a growing awareness that his worth might have nothing to do with how useful he was. After 7 months, he returned to Yale and continued to write and teach, but he found himself still wrestling with those questions. And eventually he left Yale, and after a period of searching about what might come next, Harvard invited him to teach there. This man who was trying to learn that he didn't need accomplishments to tell him who he was kept becoming more accomplished, and yet still unhappy. He could so beautifully tell other people about prayer and community and the love of God, but he remained less certain about how to receive it himself. So after only a few years, he left Harvard and moved to France, and for a time was part of the L'Arche community, and eventually became a pastor for the L'Arche Daybreak community outside of Toronto. Now, this is a place where people with intellectual disabilities live together with those who assist him. And at daybreak, Henry was asked to care for a young man named Adam Arnett. Adam couldn't speak and needed assistance with nearly every part of his daily routine. So every morning, Henry would wake Adam up and carry him to the bath, wash him, shave him, brush his teeth, comb his hair, dress him, walk him slowly to the kitchen, and feed him breakfast. A routine that could take an hour and a half. And at first, Henry worried the whole time that Adam couldn't tell him if the bath water was too hot or too cold. He worried he might cut him while shaving. But eventually, he stopped being afraid of getting everything wrong. And when Adam had a seizure, Henry accepted that he simply had to stop doing everything else that needed to be done and stay with him until it passed. Henry arrived thinking he was the one with something to give Adam. But in Adam's presence, Henry discovered what it was like to be simply received. Not for what he could do, but for who he was. And years later, Henry would call Adam his teacher, his friend and his guide. The professor had become the student, learning what he had struggled his whole life to believe, that you don't become somebody, you already are somebody. You are beloved. And Nouwen had actually written best-selling books about this very thing. But it was finally Adam who taught Henry how to experience it. Jesus said, "Turn around." Maybe the problem isn't that we're simply off the mark about who we call great. Maybe it's that we've confused greatness with worth. Children were certainly loved in Jesus' world, but childhood wasn't idealized in the same way as today. And Jesus isn't pointing to an adorable little face full of curiosity and wonder and telling the disciples to recover their inner child. No, when Jesus puts the child in the middle of them, he points to their place in the world, a world in which they had no status, no authority. A child stood almost at the bottom of the ladder of social status, and Jesus reverses it. The one near the bottom becomes his picture of the greatest. And we know this kind of reversal runs throughout all of Jesus' teaching. We know it as the first shall be last and the last shall be first. We've heard him say those who want to be great must become servants of all. And it's true, in the kingdom of heaven, people who have been pushed down are lifted up, and those whose voices have been ignored are heard. Reversal is justice. But is the kingdom simply a world in which people at the bottom finally get moved to the top? Maybe. But if that's all that happens, we still have the same ladder. We've just changed who gets to stand on the highest rung. But what if the kingdom goes even deeper than just reversing places? What if Jesus is freeing us from human worth related to the ladder altogether? I mean, there are differences. Some people hold positions of great power, and some carry enormous responsibility, and some achieve things that most of us never will. Some are honored and remembered for all that they've given to the world, but none of those things makes a life more vulnerable. And so maybe humility isn't, I need to move myself lower on the ladder, but discovering that my place on it cannot tell me what I am worth. And the reverse of that is true, of course, as well. Failures and weaknesses and dependency or mistakes don't make our lives any less valuable. You are already somebody. So there's one more thing I learned about Henry this week. Having read many of his books and admired his teaching for decades, I only now discovered that years before Genesee, before Harvard, before Yale, before Adam, Henry Nouwen was home watching TV, and he saw the civil rights demonstrations in Alabama. He saw the demonstrators being attacked, and he later told of that night, lying awake, unable to get those images out of his mind, wondering, why doesn't somebody do something? Which, of course, then occurred to him. He was somebody. And so in the morning, he got into his Volkswagen and drove south, and he joined the march from Selma to Montgomery just in time to walk the last day, and then was transformed by hearing Dr. King speak. Henry didn't lead the march. He wasn't remembered for even being there. He simply went and stood with them. The disciples asked Jesus, who is the greatest? And he said, you must turn your lives around. And maybe the turn is to stop worrying about where we stand and simply become open and willing to stand with one another. Amen.